The first thing I noticed was the silence, not the peaceful kind, the kind that hums in your ears when something that should have happened didn't. It was 3 days before Christmas, a Tuesday morning, and my phone sat face down on the kitchen counter, beside a mug of coffee I had already forgotten to drink. I had checked my messages twice before breakfast once, while tying my hair, and again just before leaving for work. Nothing. No text, no missed call, no passive-aggressive family group message filled with snowflake emojis and fake cheer. That was when the knot formed in my stomach, because in my family, silence was never accidental. For as long as I could remember, Christmas had been the one time of year I was expected to show up, smiling, grateful, and invisible. I was the daughter who brought store-bought pie to a table filled with catered dishes, the one who wrapped gifts carefully even when I knew mine would be an afterthought, the one who sat on the arm of the couch because all the good seats were already claimed. But I was still invited, always invited, until this year. At 9:15 in the morning, my younger sister's social media story popped up on my screen while I was waiting for an elevator downtown. She was standing in front of my parents' house in Connecticut, wrapped in a cream cashmere coat, laughing as fake snow drifted down from a machine I knew my mother had rented for photos. Behind her, the front door was already decorated with a wreath I recognized. Our wreath. Christmas prep at Mom and Dad's, the caption read. My chest went tight. I stared at the screen longer than I should have, the elevator dinging impatiently behind me. People brushed past, annoyed. I didn't move. I couldn't. That was how I found out. Not through a phone call, not through a conversation, but through my sister's perfectly filtered smile. They had gathered without me. The realization followed quickly, cruel and sharp. I hadn't missed the invitation. There hadn't been a mix-up. There hadn't been a last-minute plan I wasn't looped into. I had been excluded, on purpose. I went into the office that day on autopilot, smiled at coworkers, answered emails, sat through a meeting where my manager praised a project I had quietly carried on my back for months, then handed the credit to someone else because it was easier. That part felt familiar. I had learned long ago how to swallow that kind of injustice without choking. But this was different. This was family. By lunchtime, I couldn't focus. My hands shook as I opened my phone again, scrolling through photos my sister had posted throughout the morning. The living room, the tree, my mother's antique silver tray laid out with cookies, my father pouring wine, everyone smiling, everyone present, everyone but me. I typed a message to my mother, deleted it, typed another to my father, deleted that too. Finally, I sent a single text to the family group chat. Hey, I just saw the photos. Did plans change for Christmas this year? The typing dots appeared under my sister's name almost immediately, then vanished. Minutes passed, 10 of them. Then my mother replied, Oh, honey, we thought it would be simpler this year. With everything going on, we decided to keep it small. Small, the word burned. I stared at the screen, rereading the message until my vision blurred. There were 6 people in those photos. 6. That wasn't small, that was selective. I forced myself to type back. I understand, I just wish someone had told me. The response came from my sister this time. You've been so busy lately anyway. We didn't think you'd want to make the drive. No hard feelings. No hard feelings. That was when something inside me shifted, not snapped. Shifted, quietly, like a gear locking into place. Because the truth I had spent years avoiding finally surfaced clear and undeniable. This wasn't a misunderstanding, this wasn't thoughtlessness, this wasn't timing. This was a pattern. I thought back to birthdays forgotten until the end of the night, promotions brushed off with a quick, that's nice, family dinners where conversations flowed around me like I wasn't there. The way my parents always found a reason to excuse my sister's behavior while holding me to standards I could never quite meet. I had been earning my place in that family my entire life, and they had just revoked it. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights flickering through the window like distant stars. I poured a glass of wine I didn't really want and let myself feel it. The hurt, the anger, the familiar ache of being the one left out. But beneath it all, something else was growing. Clarity. I realized then that being excluded hurt less than being tolerated. That silence could be a gift if you listened closely enough. And that if they were willing to erase me from Christmas so easily, there were other things they had likely erased too. Wills, plans, promises. I picked up my phone and opened my contacts, scrolling past family names until I stopped at one I hadn't touched in years. Margaret Lane, my grandmother's former attorney. The woman who had once told me quietly, "Pay attention to what people don't say. That's where the truth lives." I didn't know exactly what I was going to ask her yet. I only knew this. If they thought they could push me out without consequence, they had underestimated how much I had learned by standing on the outside all these years. I set the phone down and looked around my apartment, the life I had built alone, the independence they never noticed, the strength they never acknowledged. Christmas was 3 days away, and something told me this was only the beginning. If they wanted a quiet holiday without me, I would give them one. But when the silence finally broke, it wouldn't be gentle. I didn't go to sleep that night. Not really. I lay in bed with the lights off, staring at the faint outline of the ceiling fan as it turned slowly above me. Every few minutes, my mind replayed the same images from my sister's social media story. My mother's laugh, my father's arm around her shoulders, the tree glowing in the corner like a symbol of something I was no longer allowed to touch. It wasn't just Christmas, it was confirmation. Sometime after 2 in the morning, I got up and opened the small lockbox I kept in the back of my closet. Inside were documents I rarely looked at, old tax forms, birth certificates, a manila envelope labeled estate with my grandmother's handwriting brittle and slightly slanted. She had given it to me years ago shortly before she died. "Keep this safe," she had said. "You may need it one day." At the time, I hadn't understood what she meant. I was still naive enough to believe families didn't need protection from themselves. I spread the papers out on the kitchen table and read them slowly. Trust summaries, property references, a copy of a will dated years earlier. My grandmother's will. My name appeared once. A modest bequest, symbolic. But what caught my attention was the amendment attached to it. A handwritten note referencing a separate family trust administered jointly by my parents. The wording was vague, intentionally so, but one phrase stood out. To be distributed at the discretion of the trustees. My parents. I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Suddenly, Christmas exclusion felt less like an emotional slight and more like a strategic one. I poured myself another glass of wine and opened my laptop. By dawn, I had a list. Questions I had never thought to ask. Financial patterns I had ignored. Memories that now looked different under harsher light. Why had my sister always known details about future plans before anyone else? Why had my parents brushed off my questions about long-term arrangements with vague reassurances? Why had my grandmother warned me without explaining? By the time the sun came up, my hurt had transformed into something sharper. Suspicion. I called in sick to work. Then I called Margaret Lane. She answered on the second ring. Her voice sounded older than I remembered, but just as precise. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said after I told her who I was. That stopped me cold. "You were—" "Yes," she replied calmly. "Your grandmother expected you might." We met that afternoon in her office, a quiet space that smelled faintly of paper and lemon polish. She listened without interrupting as I explained the Christmas situation, the photos, the silence, the knot in my stomach that refused to ease. When I finished, she folded her hands. "Your grandmother was very concerned about favoritism," she said. "She didn't trust your parents to remain fair once she was gone." I swallowed. "Why didn't she do anything?" "She tried," Margaret replied gently, "but she was ill, and they were persuasive." She pulled a file from her drawer and slid it across the desk toward me. "This is what I can legally show you," she said. "And this is what I can't." Inside were copies of trust documents, redacted but still revealing. Names, percentages, conditions. My sister's name appeared multiple times. Mine did not. I felt something inside me go very still. "So it's true," I whispered. Margaret nodded. "You were excluded from the primary trust." I stared at the papers, my hands numb. "When?" "Shortly after your grandmother passed," she said. "Your parents amended the structure. Perfectly legal, morally questionable." The room felt smaller, tighter. "They never told me," I said. "Of course not," she replied. "People rarely announce injustice when it benefits them." I drove home in a fog. Every memory from the past decade reassembled itself into a new picture. The subtle pressure to stay flexible, the way my parents discouraged me from buying property, the constant emphasis on being grateful rather than secure. They hadn't just favored my sister emotionally, they had planned for her and left me optional. That night my sister called. I almost didn't answer. "What's wrong with you?" she demanded the moment I picked up. "Mom's upset." "Why?" I asked calmly. You made it awkward, she snapped, questioning Christmas like that. I laughed quietly. You didn't think excluding me might do that? There was a pause, then her voice dropped. You're overreacting. Am I? Yes, she said sharply. You always do this. You take things personally. I leaned back against the counter, staring at the city through my window. Tell me something, I said. Did you know I wasn't included? Silence. That was all the answer I needed. You're being dramatic, she said finally. It's not like you need it. You're independent. There it was, the justification. You took care of me, I said slowly, by cutting me out. She scoffed. You make everything sound ugly. No, I replied. I'm just finally naming it. She hung up on me. I didn't feel shocked. I felt free. Because once you see the truth, you can't unsee it. And once you understand the rules of a game you never agreed to play, you get to decide whether you keep participating. That night, I opened a new document on my laptop and typed a single sentence at the top of the page. If they planned my future without me, I would plan theirs without asking. I didn't know yet how far this would go. I didn't know who would side with whom or what it would cost. But I knew this much. The daughter they thought would quietly accept being erased had just started paying attention. And that was the most dangerous thing I could do. The next morning, I woke with the strange calm that only comes after a decision has already been made somewhere deep inside you. Not relief, not confidence, resolve. I showered, dressed, and went to work as if nothing had changed. But everything had. Every email I answered, every meeting I sat through, I was aware of something new moving beneath the surface of my life. A current I could no longer ignore. At lunch, I took a walk instead of eating. The city was sharp with winter cold, my breath visible in front of me. I liked the sting. It kept me present. For years I had told myself a story. That my family loved me in their own way. That my role was simply different. That not everyone could be the favorite, and maturity meant accepting that quietly. That story had kept me compliant. Now it felt childish. I stopped at a small cafe and sat by the window, pulling out my phone. I scrolled through old messages, searching for patterns instead of comfort. Invitations phrased like obligations. Praise that always came with a comparison. Advice that subtly discouraged permanence. Don't tie yourself down yet. Stay flexible. You never know what might happen. What had happened was this. They had built a future that didn't include me, and they had done it while smiling to my face. That afternoon, my father called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. I hear you spoke to Margaret, he said without greeting. Straight to it, no warmth, no concern. Yes, I replied. He exhaled slow and controlled. That was unnecessary. Was it, I asked? This is family business, he said. Private. I leaned back in my chair, watching coworkers pass my office door. It became my business when I was removed from it. You weren't removed, he snapped. You were provided for. I closed my eyes. That's not the same thing, I said. You know that. Silence. Then colder. You've always wanted more. There it was. The accusation disguised as observation. I wanted transparency, I replied. I wanted to be treated like I mattered. You do matter, he said quickly, just not in the same way. I felt something loosen in my chest, a final thread snapping. Thank you, I said calmly, for finally saying it out loud. Before he could respond, I ended the call. My hands were steady. That evening, I met my brother Daniel for dinner. We hadn't been close growing up. He'd left home early, escaped in a way I never quite managed, but he had always watched quietly from the edges. You look different, he said as we sat down. Do I asked. He nodded. Lighter or heavier, I can't tell. Both, I said. I told him everything. Christmas, the trust, Margaret, the call with our father. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening with each new detail. I knew it was bad, he said finally. I didn't know it was this calculated. You left, I said. You saw it before I did. He shook his head. I ran. You survived. That mattered more to me than he knew. They're not going to back down, he added. If you push this, I know, I said. I'm counting on it. He studied me carefully. What are you planning? I took a breath. I'm not asking for anything, I said. I'm documenting everything. For what he asked. For leverage, I replied. He raised an eyebrow. That sounds dangerous. So is being erased, I said. Over the next few weeks, I became observant in a way I never had before. I saved emails, noted dates, wrote down conversations while they were still fresh. I didn't confront. I didn't accuse. I listened. My mother called twice, both times speaking in careful half-truths. She talked about family harmony, about how hard things had been since my grandmother passed, about how my sister needed stability. Never about fairness. My sister sent a single message. You're blowing this up for no reason. I didn't respond, because for the first time I understood something crucial. They didn't fear my anger. They feared my clarity. The real twist came in January. Margaret called me early one morning, her voice tight. "There's something else," she said. "Something your grandmother did that your parents may not realize I still have." My heart raced. "What?" "A letter," she said. "Not legally binding, but revealing." We met again that afternoon. The letter was handwritten. My grandmother's familiar looping script, the ink faded but legible. It detailed her concerns about favoritism, her disappointment in my parents' choices, her belief that I had been underestimated deliberately because I didn't demand attention. One line burned itself into my memory. "She will be fine if they leave her alone, but they won't." Margaret looked at me over the page. "If this becomes public," she said carefully, "it won't destroy them, but it will change how people see them." How, I asked. "As people who knew exactly what they were doing," she replied. I sat back, heart pounding. This wasn't about money anymore. This was about truth. That night, I stood by my window again, watching snow fall softly between buildings. My reflection stared back at me, unfamiliar and fierce. I thought of all the times I had minimized myself to keep peace, all the apologies I'd offered just to be included, all the silence I'd accepted as love. No more. They thought I was the daughter who wouldn't fight back, the quiet one, the grateful one, the expendable one. They were wrong. And soon they were going to learn what happens when the person you never counted on finally stops protecting your secrets. By February, the snow had turned dirty along the sidewalks, packed into gray piles that refused to melt. I felt the same way inside. Not cold, not numb, just compressed. Years of things unsaid pressed together until there was no room left to ignore them. I didn't confront my parents. I didn't threaten. I didn't demand answers. I did something far more dangerous. I waited. Waiting had always been my role, but this time it was intentional, strategic. I let them believe I was sulking, that I would eventually calm down, apologize for the tension, and accept whatever explanation they offered. They were used to that version of me. Meanwhile, I prepared. Margaret helped me organize everything: emails, financial statements, trust summaries, notes from conversations going back years. Daniel quietly sent me documents. He still had access to things he'd never bothered to look at closely before. Together, they told a story my parents had never expected to be read all at once. It wasn't illegal. That was the part that made it worse. It was calculated. They had structured things so my sister received security, assets, and authority, while I was encouraged toward independence without permanence. I was the backup plan, the self-sufficient one, the child they didn't need to worry about because I would be fine. And they were right about one thing: I was fine. But not in the way they assumed. The call came from my mother on a Sunday afternoon. "I miss you," she said softly. "Things feel broken." I leaned against the counter, phone warm in my hand. "They are. We never meant for you to feel excluded," she continued. "Families aren't perfect." I waited. She sighed. "Your sister is under a lot of pressure." "There it is," I said. She went quiet. "I'm not competing with her," I continued. "I'm asking why I was never allowed the same protection." "You didn't need it," she said quickly. "You were always strong." That word again. Strong. It had been their favorite excuse. "I didn't need protection," I said slowly. "Or you didn't want to give it." Her breath caught. "That's not fair." "Neither was cutting me out without telling me," I replied. She didn't deny it. That silence confirmed everything. 2 days later, my father requested a meeting. Not at their house, not at mine. At a quiet restaurant halfway between us. Neutral territory. He arrived early, sat stiffly, hands folded, expression controlled. He looked older than I remembered, smaller somehow. "We're concerned," he began once we were seated, "about where this is heading." "So am I said calmly. "You've involved lawyers," he said. "I consulted one," I corrected. "That's different." He frowned. "You're escalating." "No," I replied. "I'm responding." He leaned back. "What do you want?" The question hung between us. I could have said money. I could have said inclusion. I could have said an apology. But none of those were the truth. "I want you to stop pretending this was an accident," I said. "I want acknowledgement." He studied me for a long moment. "You were never supposed to see it that way." I smiled faintly, "But I do." His jaw tightened. "You're risking permanent damage." "Yes," I said, to the illusion. The check came. We paid separately. That night I received a message from my sister. "You're making Mom cry." I stared at it, feeling nothing. "Tell her I cried too," I typed back. "For years." She didn't respond. The next development came unexpectedly. My parents hosted a small dinner party, one of their carefully curated gatherings with longtime friends, business associates, and extended family. I wasn't invited. That part didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was the call I received the next morning from my aunt. I didn't know, she said, her voice strained, about the trust. Most people didn't, I replied. They were talking, she continued. Someone asked why you weren't involved anymore. Your father stumbled. I closed my eyes. That was the crack. Margaret had warned me. Secrets don't hold under casual scrutiny. Not forever. The letter from my grandmother stayed in my drawer untouched. I hadn't shared it. Not yet. But its existence changed how I moved through the world. I was no longer guessing. I knew. By the end of February, the tension had spread beyond our immediate family. Whispers, questions, subtle shifts in how people interacted with my parents. Nothing dramatic, just discomfort. My mother called again, her voice tight. This is getting out of hand, she said. You should have thought of that before, I replied gently. You're enjoying this, she accused. I paused. No, I'm finished hiding. The truth was I didn't feel victorious. I felt steady, because for the first time I wasn't reacting to their choices. I was allowing them to face the consequences. The lever they never knew I held wasn't legal or financial. It was narrative. They had always controlled the story of our family. Who mattered, who struggled, who succeeded, who was quietly expected to accept less. Now that story was slipping out of their hands. And once people start asking questions, the answers rarely stay contained. I stood by my window that night watching the city settle into darkness. Somewhere across the state, my parents were likely doing the same thing they always did when uncomfortable. Closing ranks, managing appearances, waiting for me to back down. They didn't understand yet. I wasn't trying to destroy them. I was letting the truth breathe. And in a family built on silence, that alone was enough to bring everything down. March arrived with a kind of false optimism. The days grew longer, the air softened, and people began to talk about spring as if it were a promise. In my family, it was treated more like a deadline. I felt it in the way my mother's voice tightened when she called, in the clipped politeness of my father's emails, in the sudden awkward friendliness of relatives who hadn't spoken to me in years but now wanted to check in. The truth had begun to circulate and no one knew quite what to do with it. I kept my routine steady. Work-home walks through the city. On the surface, nothing had changed, but underneath, everything had. I was no longer bracing myself for disappointment. I was observing. That distance gave me perspective. One afternoon, I met Daniel again, this time at a quiet park halfway between our offices. We sat on a bench, coats open, coffee cooling in our hands. They're scared, he said without preamble. Of what, I asked. He glanced at me, of losing control of the story. I nodded. That's what they value most. He hesitated. Dad asked me something last week. I waited. He wanted to know if you were planning to make things public. My stomach tightened, but my voice stayed calm. What did you say? That I didn't know, Daniel replied, which is true. I exhaled slowly. They think I'm bluffing. They're hoping you are, he said. That night, my sister showed up at my apartment unannounced. I opened the door and found her standing there, arms crossed, expression already defensive. This has gone far enough, she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I closed the door behind her. You didn't seem concerned when I was excluded, I said evenly. That was different, she snapped. This is embarrassing. For who, I asked. She rolled her eyes. For all of us. There it was. The collective responsibility I had always been expected to carry. You benefited from this, I said quietly. Did you ever ask why? She scoffed. I didn't design the trust. No, I agreed, but you accepted it. Her jaw tightened. Because I deserved it. The words landed exactly where they were meant to. I studied her face. The certainty, the entitlement, the complete lack of curiosity about anyone else's experience. Then live with it, I said. Her voice rose. You're punishing everyone because you feel slighted. I shook my head. I'm refusing to absorb the cost of your comfort. She stared at me, stunned. I didn't ask for this fight, she said finally. I didn't ask to be erased, I replied. She left without another word. After that, things escalated quickly. My parents called a family meeting. Not a conversation, a meeting. Daniel warned me in advance. They're going to try to frame this as reconciliation. I smiled faintly. They always do. We met at their house, the same one from my childhood. Nothing had changed. Same furniture, same photos on the walls, same sense that the past was being preserved carefully, selectively. My parents sat together on the couch, my sister beside them. I took the chair opposite. My mother spoke first. We want to move forward. My father nodded. As a family. I folded my hands. Then let's talk honestly. Silence stretched. This situation, my mother continued, has become unnecessarily public. I waited. We made decisions we thought were best, my father said. There was no malicious intent. Intent doesn't erase impact, I replied. My sister scoffed. You're acting like a victim. I was one, I said calmly. You just didn't notice. My mother's eyes filled with tears. We did the best we could. That's what people say when they don't want to change, I replied. My father leaned forward. What do you want exactly? I met his gaze. Acknowledgement, transparency, and a correction. My sister laughed bitterly. You want a rewrite? No, I said. I want the truth reflected. My father sighed. You're asking us to undo years of planning. Yes, I replied, because those years were built on exclusion. The room felt heavy charged. And if we don't, my sister asked. I paused, choosing my words carefully. Then I stop protecting the version of this family you prefer, I said, and I tell my story. My mother gasped. You wouldn't. I already am, I said softly. The meeting ended without resolution. But something had shifted. They no longer saw me as a problem to be managed. They saw me as a risk. In the days that followed, the pressure intensified. Subtle threats, guilt-laced messages, warnings disguised as concern. You'll regret burning bridges. People will think you're unstable. This could affect your career. Each message revealed the same truth. They had never worried about my well-being. They worried about exposure. Margaret called me late one evening. They've contacted me, she said. Fishing, trying to assess how much you know. And I asked? I told them nothing, she replied, but you should be prepared. They may try to discredit you. I felt a flicker of fear, then something steadier. Let them try, I said, because I finally understood the price of keeping quiet. It wasn't peace. It was erasure, and I was done paying it. As March bled into April, I felt the tension coil tighter, like something waiting to snap. They thought silence was my weakness. They were about to learn it had only ever been my restraint. April didn't arrive gently. It came with pressure deadlines and a shift so sharp I felt it before anyone said a word. The first sign was work, not my performance. That stayed solid. If anything, I was sharper than ever. But the tone around me changed. A meeting rescheduled without explanation. A decision made without looping me in. A question asked twice as if the first answer hadn't been trusted. It was subtle, plausible, easy to deny, and immediately familiar. By the end of the first week, my manager called me into her office. She didn't sit behind her desk. She chose the chair across from me instead. That told me everything. There's been some concern, she said carefully, about what I asked. She folded her hands. Distraction. Personal matters affecting focus. I almost laughed. I haven't missed a deadline, I said. My last project exceeded targets. She nodded quickly. Yes, absolutely. This isn't about results. Of course it wasn't. It was about narrative. Someone contacted HR, she continued. Anonymously, they raised questions about your stability. There it was. My chest tightened, but my voice stayed even. Did they provide evidence? She hesitated. No, just context. Context. The favorite weapon of people who don't want to say the ugly thing out loud. I left her office calm on the outside, vibrating on the inside. They had crossed a line. My parents had always controlled family stories, but this was my livelihood, my independence, the life I had built separate from them. That night, Daniel confirmed my suspicion. Dad called one of his old contacts, he said quietly over the phone. Someone connected to your industry. I closed my eyes. He tried to undermine me. Yes, Daniel said, and Mom signed off on it. Something cold settled in my stomach. They weren't trying to reconcile anymore. They were trying to neutralize me. Margaret was furious when I told her. This is retaliation, she said sharply, and it's sloppy. What do? I asked. You document everything, she replied. Dates, names, language, and you don't react emotionally. I'm past emotional, I said. I'm done being careful. Good, she replied. Because they're underestimating you again. The pressure escalated quickly after that. A cousin posted a vague message online about family members who thrive on drama. An aunt stopped returning my calls. Friends of my parents began asking pointed questions, pretending concern while clearly fishing. I felt surrounded. But I wasn't alone. One afternoon, a colleague I barely knew stopped by my desk. I don't know what's going on, she said quietly, but someone tried to warn me about you. I looked up, surprised, and she shrugged. It didn't make sense. You've always been solid. That mattered more than she knew, because while my parents were trying to poison the well quietly, they were doing it too late. I had already built credibility they couldn't touch. Still, the attempt hurt. Not because it worked, because it proved something I had avoided admitting for years. They would rather damage me than admit wrongdoing. That realization stripped away the last bit of hope I didn't realize I was still carrying. The breaking point came mid-April. My mother showed up at my apartment. This time she didn't cry, she didn't plead. She was cold. "You're forcing our hand," she said, standing in my living room like a stranger. "You forced mine," I replied. "We've protected you your whole life," she said sharply. I laughed. I couldn't help it. From what I asked, fairness, she stiffened. "You're not thinking clearly." "Don't," I said, my voice suddenly hard. "Don't try to take my mind from me." She flinched. "You think people won't notice what you're doing," she continued. "You think this won't follow you." I stepped closer. "I think you're scared." Her eyes flashed. "Of what?" "Of losing control," I said, "and you should be." She left without another word. That night, I sat alone in the dark, the city humming outside my window. I felt exhausted in a way sleep wouldn't fix. But I also felt certain. They had shown me their final card, and it was ugly. The next morning, I made a decision. I called Margaret, then Daniel, then a lawyer she recommended, one who specialized in reputational harm and retaliation. By the end of the week, everything was formal. Letters sent, records requested, a paper trail established. No accusations, just facts. My parents didn't respond. My sister blocked me. And for the first time since this began, I smiled. Because when people resort to trying to break you, it's usually because they know they can't beat you any other way. They thought attacking my stability would silence me. Instead, it clarified everything. This wasn't about inheritance anymore. This was about dignity. And I wasn't going to let them take that too. As April closed, the tension shifted again. Not louder, quieter. The kind of quiet that comes before something gives way. They had tried to erase me, then to discredit me. Next, they would try to rewrite the ending. They didn't know yet that I had already chosen mine. By May, the silence from my parents had turned strategic. No calls, no messages, no passive-aggressive check-ins disguised as concern. Just absence. At first, it felt like a relief. I slept better. I worked without bracing myself for the next emotional ambush. The background noise of my childhood quieted in a way that felt almost unnatural. Then I understood what it was. They weren't done. They were regrouping. The first sign came through an email forwarded by Daniel. It was short, professionally worded, and addressed to several extended family members. "We are saddened by the ongoing situation with our daughter. We are hopeful she will seek the help she needs so we can move forward as a family." I read it twice. Help she needs. There it was, the final narrative. If they couldn't paint me as ungrateful, they would paint me as unstable. My hands shook, not with fear, but with anger so clean it startled me. For years I had been careful not to embarrass them, careful not to speak out of turn, careful not to confirm the unspoken accusation that something was wrong with me. And now they were using that restraint against me. Margaret was blunt when I showed her the message. "This is character assassination," she said. "Soft but intentional." "They're laying groundwork," I replied. "Yes," she said, "for when the truth comes out." Because they knew it would. They could feel it. I drafted a response a dozen times and deleted every version. Explanations, clarifications, emotional appeals. All of it felt wrong. Then something clicked. I didn't owe anyone a defense. The moment you start defending yourself against a false narrative, you give it oxygen. Instead, I did something else. I told the truth quietly. Not online, not publicly. Directly. I met with two relatives I trusted. Not to persuade them, but to explain. Calmly, factually. I shared documents, timelines, the trust structure, the exclusion. I answered questions without emotion, and I watched their expressions change. One of them said, "Why didn't you ever say anything?" I smiled sadly. I thought love required silence. That sentence did more than any argument ever could. Word spread not through gossip, but through disbelief. People comparing notes, remembering moments that hadn't made sense at the time, reframing my silence not as distance but as endurance. The narrative my parents tried to plant didn't take root. It withered. That was when they escalated. My father filed a formal complaint with my employer's board, alleging conflict of interest tied to family disputes. It was thin, almost laughable, but it forced a review. I sat across from three executives in a glass conference room, hands folded, heart steady. I answered every question, provided every document, disclosed everything voluntarily. When it was over, one of them leaned back and said, "This seems like a personal matter being dragged into a professional space." "Yes," I said, "that's exactly what it is." The complaint was dismissed. Privately, I was advised to consider legal protection. Publicly, nothing changed. But something fundamental shifted inside me. I stopped trying to be understood. Understanding had never protected me before. Clarity had. That night alone in my apartment, I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, breathing slowly. I thought about the little girl I had been, the one who waited for invitations, the one who believed if she behaved well enough, she would be chosen eventually. She had done nothing wrong. She had just been born into a family that needed a scapegoat. The realization didn't make me sad. It made me strong. I drafted one final message to my parents, not emotional, not accusatory. Clear. I am aware of the statements you've made about me. Any further attempts to damage my reputation will be handled through legal counsel. I will no longer engage privately. I sent it. Then I blocked their numbers. The silence that followed was different. It wasn't punishment. It was peace. For the first time in my life, I wasn't waiting for them to change. I was done explaining myself to people committed to misunderstanding me. Outside, the city buzzed with early summer life. People laughing on patios, cars honking, someone's music drifting through an open window. Life was moving on, and so was I. I didn't know yet how this would end. I didn't know what final card they were holding or how ugly they might get before letting go. But I knew this. They no longer controlled the story. And I was no longer the quiet daughter absorbing the damage so everyone else could stay comfortable. Whatever came next, I would meet it standing. Because the moment I stopped defending myself was the moment they lost their power over me. And they could feel it. June arrived with heat that clung to everything. The city felt swollen with noise and impatience, like everyone was bracing for something to break. I felt it too, not dread, anticipation. The silence from my parents had stretched long enough to become suspicious. No more emails, no more intermediaries, no more carefully worded concern. People who give up control don't do it quietly. They regroup. The break came from an unexpected place. My Aunt Helen called me one evening while I was chopping vegetables for dinner. Her voice sounded thin, uncertain. "I'm not sure I should be calling you," she said. That told me everything. "You should," I replied calmly. She exhaled. "I was at your parents' house today. Your mother asked me to help go through some old paperwork. Estate-related." I set the knife down slowly. And I saw something," she said. "Something with your name on it." My pulse quickened, but my voice stayed steady. "What kind of something?" "There was an older draft," she said, "of the trust, before it was amended." The room seemed to tilt. "Did it include me?" I asked. "Yes," Helen said quietly, "equally." I closed my eyes. "Not reduced, not symbolic, equal." "They said it was outdated," she continued. "That you'd chosen a different path, that it no longer reflected reality." "And you believed them?" I asked gently. There was a pause, then not anymore. She sent me photos that night. Grainy, taken quickly but clear enough. My name, my sister's name, identical language, identical percentages. Then a second set of documents, the amended version. My name gone, replaced by a discretionary clause that funneled control entirely to my parents and eventually to my sister. My hands trembled as I scrolled. This wasn't favoritism disguised as care. This was removal. Deliberate, documented, planned. Margaret confirmed it the next morning. "They never told you because they didn't have to," she said. "They assumed you'd never see this." "What does this mean legally?" I asked. She was careful. "The amendment is valid, but the intent is questionable." I laughed softly. "Questionable how?" "In a way that becomes very uncomfortable if examined publicly," she replied. That was the opening. Not a lawsuit. Leverage. The difference between the two versions wasn't just financial. It was philosophical. The earlier draft recognized me as a daughter. The amended one treated me like a contingency. And now I had proof. I didn't rush. That was the hardest part. Every instinct told me to confront them, to demand answers, to force acknowledgement. But I had learned. Timing mattered more than truth alone. I waited 2 weeks. In that time, my parents made their move. They invited extended family to a 4th of July gathering. Big, loud, patriotic, performative. I was not invited. Instead, my sister posted a photo of the invitation carelessly visible in the background of a story. Red, white, and blue script. Family celebration. I smiled. They were consolidating support. They didn't know I had just gained something far more powerful. The gathering happened on a Sunday. On Monday morning, I sent a single email. Not to them. To everyone. Aunt Helen, Uncle Mark, 2 cousins, a family friend who had once been close to my grandmother, and my parents. Attached were the 2 versions of the trust documents. No commentary, no accusations, just a short note. I recently came across earlier and amended versions of Grandma's trust. I wanted to be sure everyone had the same information. That was it. I hit send and turned off my phone. When I turned it back on an hour later, there were 14 missed calls. My mother, my father, my sister, unknown numbers. I ignored them all. The first message I read was from Daniel. "What did you do?" I typed back. I told the truth. The second was from my aunt. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry." The third from my father. "This was a private family matter. You had no right." I didn't reply, because for the first time the story was no longer being told in whispers. It was being read. That evening Margaret called me. "They're panicking," she said. "Your father asked for a meeting," where I asked. "At their house," she replied. "With witnesses." I smiled. "Tell him I'll come," I said, "with mine." The meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening. I arrived with Margaret. They were already seated, my parents on the couch, my sister rigid in a chair, jaw tight, two relatives hovering near the window, uncomfortable. The air felt thick. My father stood as I entered. "You blindsided us." "No," I replied calmly. "You concealed information. I shared it." My mother's eyes were red. "How could you do this to us?" I met her gaze. "How could you do it to me?" Silence. My sister spoke sharply. "You're twisting this." I turned to her. "Explain how." She opened her mouth, then closed it. Margaret placed the documents on the table. "The earlier version includes equal treatment," she said. "The amendment removes one child entirely. That requires explanation." My father rubbed his temples. "We made a judgment call." "About my worth," I said. "No," he snapped. "About practicality." "There it is," I said softly. The room shifted. People shifted. Because everyone heard it. This wasn't about need. It was about convenience. And convenience had a favorite. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't threaten. I let the documents speak. When the meeting ended, nothing was resolved. But everything was exposed. As I walked out of that house for the last time, I felt something unexpected. Not triumph. Relief. The document they never meant for me to see had finally put words to what I had felt my entire life. I hadn't imagined it. I hadn't exaggerated. I had been deliberately set aside. And now everyone knew. The real revenge wasn't what I planned to do next. It was what they could no longer undo. The fallout didn't explode the way people imagine these things do. There were no screaming phone calls, no public scenes, no dramatic confrontations in driveways or at holiday tables. What happened instead was worse for them. People started thinking. The days after the documents were shared felt unnaturally quiet. My phone stayed mostly silent, but I could feel movement happening around me, like pressure changing before a storm. Conversations I wasn't part of. Opinions forming without my parents' guidance. Memories being revisited with new context. I went to work, I answered emails, I took meetings, but I paid attention. Because when a family built on control starts losing it, the cracks show in unexpected places. The first real sign came from a family friend named Richard. He'd known my parents since before I was born. I remembered him as loud, charming, always praising my sister's accomplishments at dinner parties. He called me late one evening. "I owe you an apology," he said without preamble. "For what I asked. For believing a version of things that was convenient," he replied. "Your grandmother spoke highly of you. I didn't listen closely enough." I swallowed. "Thank you for saying that. I won't pretend this isn't uncomfortable," he added. "But it's necessary." After that, more messages followed. Quiet ones. Careful ones. People asking questions without accusing. People admitting confusion. People acknowledging that something hadn't felt right for a long time, even if they couldn't articulate it before. My parents, on the other hand, grew louder. My mother left a voicemail accusing me of humiliation. My father sent a formal email demanding I stop distributing private documents. My sister posted a long, emotional message online about betrayal vague enough to avoid specifics, but dramatic enough to invite sympathy. I didn't respond. That silence wasn't weakness anymore. It was position. Margaret called me midweek. "They've contacted another attorney," she said. "Not to sue you, to contain you." "Contain how?" I asked. "By offering a settlement," she replied. I laughed. "A settlement for what?" "Your silence," she said simply. The offer came through my father the next day. He asked to meet again, neutral location, public place, just the two of us. I agreed. We sat across from each other in a quiet cafe. He looked tired, older than I'd ever seen him. Not defeated, but unsettled. "We want to move forward," he said, repeating the same line as before. "You keep using that phrase," I replied. "But you mean move past." He frowned. "Isn't that the same?" "No," I said calmly. "Moving forward requires accountability. Moving past requires my cooperation." He sighed. "We're willing to revise things." "How?" I asked. "Financially," he said. "There are ways to make this right." I tilted my head. Right for whom? For you, he said quickly. For everyone. I leaned back. You didn't come here to make things right. You came here to make this go away. His jaw tightened. You're being stubborn. No, I replied. I'm being clear. He lowered his voice. You don't understand the damage this is causing. I understand it perfectly, I said. It's just not damaging me. That was the moment I saw it. The shift. For the first time in my life, my father didn't have leverage over me. Not emotional, not financial, not narrative. He was negotiating from fear. I'm not interested in money, I said. I'm interested in truth. He scoffed. Truth doesn't pay bills. It does when you've built a life on lies, I replied. We left without agreement, but I knew something important had happened. They had tried to buy my silence, which meant they had finally understood the risk. That weekend, my parents' social circle fractured quietly. Invitations were rescinded, dinners postponed. People didn't want to be in the middle of something they suddenly realized wasn't just family drama, but a pattern of manipulation. My mother stopped posting online. My sister deleted her emotional message. The narrative had lost momentum. And then came the moment I hadn't expected. My sister called. I almost didn't answer. But I did. Her voice was brittle. Are you happy now? I closed my eyes. That's not the right question. Everyone's judging us, she snapped. They look at me differently. Welcome to my childhood, I said quietly. She was silent for a long time. You never wanted this, she said finally. No, I replied. I wanted fairness. That wasn't enough for you, she accused. I laughed softly. It was never even offered. She exhaled shakily. They're talking about changing things. Why now, I asked. Because they're scared, she admitted. There it was. I didn't feel satisfaction. I felt confirmation. I'm not fighting you, she said. I just don't know who I am without them backing me. I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. That's something you'll have to figure out, I said, like I did. When the call ended, I sat in silence for a long time. The balance had shifted. Not because I'd won, but because I was no longer participating in the game they designed. They could revise documents, reframe stories, offer concessions, but they could never put things back the way they were. The illusion of fairness was gone, and once people see that, they don't forget. That night, I walked through my neighborhood as the sun dipped low, the air warm against my skin. I thought about how long I had waited for someone to choose me. I stopped walking and smiled to myself. I had finally done it, and that changed everything. By the time July arrived, the tension had matured into something else. Resignation, not acceptance, not peace, just the weary understanding that the old rules no longer applied. My parents stopped calling altogether. My sister limited herself to brief neutral messages that felt more like formalities than attempts at connection. Extended family split quietly into camps, though no one announced it. They didn't have to. Invitations spoke for them. Silence did too. And then came the offer. It arrived in an envelope, thick and formal, delivered to my mailbox on a Tuesday afternoon. No return address, but I recognized the law firm immediately. Old money, conservative. The kind that handled things quietly, so reputations stayed intact. I didn't open it right away. I carried it upstairs, set it on the kitchen table, and made myself a cup of tea. I sat down, waited for my hands to stop trembling, then broke the seal. Inside was a proposal. Revised trust terms, retroactive recognition, financial compensation framed as a correction, not an apology, carefully worded language that avoided admission of wrongdoing while offering enough to make the problem disappear. They weren't giving me equality. They were offering me silence. I read every page slowly. There it was again, disguised as generosity. The assumption that I could be managed if the numbers were right, that my dignity had a price. I called Margaret. They're trying to buy time, she said after reviewing it. And your cooperation. What happens if I sign, I asked. You get money, she replied. And you give up the right to speak publicly about the process. And if I don't, they'll say they tried. I stared at the window, watching a couple across the street argue softly on their balcony. Do you think it's fair? Margaret didn't hesitate. No. But fairness has never been their goal. That night, Daniel came over. He read the proposal without comment, then handed it back to me. They don't get it, he said quietly. No, I agreed. They still think this is a negotiation. He studied my face. What are you going to do? I folded the papers carefully. I'm going to respond. On my terms. The response wasn't long. I thanked them for acknowledging the imbalance. I declined the financial offer. I refused the confidentiality clause. And I requested one thing only. A written statement. Public. Acknowledging that I had been removed from the trust without my knowledge and that the decision had been made unilaterally by my parents. No spin, no justification, no euphemisms. Just truth. Margaret warned me, they may never agree. I know, I said, that's the point. The reply came faster than I expected. My father called. His voice was tight, controlled, and stripped of its usual authority. You're being unreasonable, he said. I'm being honest, I replied. You're asking us to humiliate ourselves. I paused. You humiliated me in private for years. That's not the same, he snapped. No, I said quietly. It's worse. Silence. You'll get nothing if you keep pushing, he warned. I smiled. I already have everything I need. He hung up. A week passed, then another. The envelope remained unopened on my counter, a reminder of how close they were to understanding and how far they still were from accountability. And then something unexpected happened. The statement appeared, not exactly as I requested, but close enough. It was sent to extended family and shared privately among their social circle, carefully worded but unmistakable. An acknowledgement of exclusion, a reference to regret, a vague admission that decisions had been made without full consideration. It wasn't justice, but it was a crack. People reached out again, some apologetic, some awkward, some simply curious. And in those conversations, I noticed something important. No one asked me why I'd pushed so hard. They asked how I'd endured so long. That shift mattered, because the narrative had changed. I was no longer the difficult daughter, the dramatic one, the unstable one. I was the one who had been quietly wronged and finally stopped absorbing it. And my parents knew it. They didn't call. They didn't explain. They retreated. The summer heat pressed in as July turned to August. I focused on work, on friends, on building a life that no longer revolved around proximity to people who saw me as expendable. One evening, sitting alone on my balcony, I thought about the proposal still sitting on my table. I realized something then. They had offered me money because that was the only language they understood. But I had learned another one: clarity. And clarity had already cost them more than any check ever could. As the sun set, casting the city in gold, I tore the proposal in half. Not in anger, in finality. Because what they offered when they couldn't control me wasn't restitution. It was proof. Proof that I had won something far more valuable than inheritance. I had taken back authorship of my own story, and they couldn't negotiate that away. The quiet that followed wasn't empty. It was spacious. August stretched out in front of me like a room I had never been allowed to enter before. No constant bracing, no scanning for the next emotional ambush, no background noise of expectation humming in my chest. I hadn't realized how much energy it took to remain legible to people committed to misunderstanding me. Without that weight, ordinary things felt different. Mornings slowed. I drank my coffee while it was still hot. I chose clothes because I liked them, not because they sent the right message. I stopped rehearsing conversations in my head that would never happen anyway. At work, something unexpected occurred. I was promoted, not quietly, not as a consolation prize, openly, with explanation, with acknowledgement of my leadership and consistency over time. During the meeting, my manager said, "You've shown clarity under pressure. That's rare." I smiled, but inside I felt something settle. For years, my family had framed my steadiness as passivity, my restraint as weakness, my independence as something that made me easier to dismiss. Here it was the reason I was trusted. That contrast stayed with me. Daniel visited again in late August. We walked through a farmer's market, the air heavy with sun and late summer fruit. "They're not talking about you anymore," he said carefully. I paused at a stall selling peaches. "That's good." He glanced at me. "Is it?" "Yes," I said, surprising myself with how certain I felt. "It means they're adjusting." To what he asked. To my absence, I replied, and the fact that it didn't break me. He nodded slowly. "They don't know what to do with that." Neither did I at first. There were moments when the old reflex surfaced, when I saw a family laughing together in public, when someone mentioned holidays, when the calendar crept toward Thanksgiving without any mention of plans. Grief still came, but it was different now. It wasn't tangled with self-blame. It didn't ask me to fix anything. It just passed through like weather. One afternoon, I received a message from my mother. Short, neutral. "I hope you're well." I stared at it for a long time. In the past, I would have rushed to reply. Filled the silence, offered reassurance, made space for her feelings before checking my own. This time I asked myself a simple question. What do I want? The answer was clear. Peace. I typed back, "I am. I hope you are too." And I left it at that. No opening, no invitation. Just truth. That was when I understood something important. Boundaries aren't walls. They're filters. They don't keep everyone out. They let the right things in. As summer waned, I started saying yes to things I had once postponed indefinitely. A weekend trip, a ceramics class, a book club filled with women who spoke honestly about their lives without competing or comparing. One evening after class, a woman in her 60s lingered beside me while we washed our hands. "You speak like someone who's been quiet for a long time," she said gently. I smiled. "What changed?" she asked. I considered it. I stopped trying to be chosen. She nodded, eyes soft. "That'll do it." At home that night, I pulled out the old lockbox from my closet, the one with the manila envelope, my grandmother's papers. I hadn't opened it in months. I spread everything out again, but this time it felt different. Not accusatory, not painful, historical. This wasn't evidence anymore. It was context. I thought about my grandmother, about what she must have seen and felt, about the limits she faced, about the quiet ways she tried to warn me. I didn't feel anger toward her. I felt gratitude, because she had planted something in me long before I knew I would need it. The ability to observe, to wait, to trust myself even when no one else validated what I saw. One night, lying in bed with the window open, listening to the city breathe, I realized I hadn't thought about the trust or the money in weeks. Not because it didn't matter, because it no longer defined anything. What defined me now were choices: who I let close, what I tolerated, where I invested my energy. Those were my assets, and no one could amend them out from under me. The final message from my sister came near the end of the month. "I don't know if we'll ever be close again," she wrote, "but I hope you know I didn't plan to hurt you." I read it once, then again, and I understood something she didn't. Intent doesn't erase pattern. "I believe you," I wrote back, "and I'm choosing distance anyway." She didn't reply. That was all right, because closeness without accountability had cost me too much already. As August faded into September, I stood on my balcony one evening and watched the sky darken. The city lights flickered on, one by one, steady and indifferent. I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time. I fit. Not into my family's narrative, not into the role they designed, into my own life. The space they had vacated wasn't empty. It was finally mine. And that was when I knew the ending was close. Not because everything was resolved, but because I had become someone who no longer needed resolution from people who refused to change. The story wasn't about what they took anymore. It was about what I built after I stopped trying to earn a place where I was never meant to stay. By the time autumn arrived, I stopped waiting for something to happen. That was the final change. Not the emails that never came, not the invitations that stayed unsent, not the apologies that arrived incomplete or not at all. I stopped waiting. The trees outside my apartment window turned slowly, deliberately. Green to gold to rust. No announcement, no permission, just change unfolding because it was time. I thought about how many years I had lived like that wasn't allowed, waiting to be invited, waiting to be included, waiting to be chosen, as if my life was a holding pattern until someone else decided I mattered. That illusion dissolved quietly. Thanksgiving came and went. I spent it with friends gathered around a mismatched table, laughing over food that didn't look perfect, but tasted like effort and care. No one compared. No one kept score. No one disappeared into silence when conversations got real. When I went home that night, I felt full in a way nothing from my childhood ever gave me. Not because it was better, because it was honest. In December, my parents sent a card. Just a card. No letter, no explanation, no attempt to reopen anything. A neutral greeting, signed with both their names, the handwriting careful, almost formal. I held it for a long time before placing it in a drawer, not because it hurt, because it no longer required a response. That was the moment I understood what I had actually inherited. Not money, not property, not approval. Perspective. I could see them now without longing, without distortion, without the ache that once made me doubt myself. They were people who confused control with care, silence with harmony, convenience with fairness. They weren't monsters, but they were never safe for me. And that distinction mattered. I thought of my sister too. How much of her identity had been propped up by certainty she didn't earn and pressure she didn't question. How terrifying it must be to realize your footing isn't solid. I didn't envy her anymore. I didn't resent her either. I simply released her. At work, my life expanded. I took on a new team. I mentored women who reminded me of myself years ago, capable, thoughtful, careful not to ask for too much. I told them things no one had ever told me. Document your work. Trust your instincts. Silence is not consent. You don't have to stay where you're diminished to prove you're strong. I watched something open in their faces when they heard that. And I knew this was how cycles ended. Not with confrontation, with clarity passed forward. On my birthday, I spent the day alone by choice. I walked through the city, bought myself a small gift, ate dinner somewhere quiet and unremarkable. I didn't feel lonely. I felt present. Later that night, I sat on my couch, lights low, the city breathing outside my windows. I thought about the girl I had been, the one who learned early how to be agreeable, how to endure, how to disappear just enough to keep peace. She hadn't been weak, she had been surviving. But survival is not a life. I whispered something into the quiet room, something I wish I had heard much earlier. You don't have to earn dignity. You don't have to prove pain. You don't have to wait. The revenge I imagined at the beginning of all this had been loud, exposing, corrective, a reckoning. What I got instead was better. I became ungovernable to people who needed me small. That was the true payback. Not destruction, detachment. I didn't take their money. I didn't take their terms. I took my time back, my voice, my sense of self. The inheritance I claimed couldn't be amended, withheld, or rewritten behind closed doors. It lived in my body now, in how I walked into rooms without bracing, in how I made decisions without explaining myself, in how I no longer confused familiarity with love. If you're hearing this and something inside you feels uncomfortably seen, I want you to know this. Being excluded doesn't mean you lack value. Being overlooked doesn't mean you are invisible. Sometimes it means you were too real for a system built on denial. And if you've ever been the quiet one in your family, the responsible one, the one who held things together while others were rewarded, I hope you remember this. You are allowed to leave the table. You are allowed to stop explaining. You are allowed to build a life that doesn't include people who only love you when you're useful. If this story resonated with you, if you've lived through family drama, favoritism, betrayal, or the slow burn of realizing you deserved better, I invite you to share your story in the comments. You are not alone. And if you want more stories about revenge that becomes justice, about women who stop shrinking and start choosing themselves, like this video and subscribe. Because sometimes the most powerful ending isn't watching others fall. It's watching yourself finally stand where you belong.